Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one there's a small change. The Russians have managed to advance in the forest patch in the western parts of Zarizova. Besides that, there's been no additional frontline changes all across the front line that has been reported. So far, none of my sources have been reporting properly since this 1st of March. This is likely due to weather complications. Trump, Zelenskyy, and JD Vance ended up in a high-tension fight discussion during Zelenskyy's visit to the White House, where Trump and JD Vance thought that Zelenskyy was disrespectful to them. Despite all the help the United States have given Ukraine, they felt that they weren't receiving the necessary respect to reflect that. And with the mineral deal still not signed, they felt like they were getting a bad deal out of this. Trump has never liked Zelenskyy, as we've seen through these past months of how he has talked about Zelenskyy, and at some point even calling him a dictator. And now we see the reality of this with this live discussion, which ended up in a heated discussion. So we see that since then, the frontline situation has been extremely calm. There's only been about 5 frontline changes throughout the first 3 days of March, and here into the 4th day, we're still seeing barely any changes. Yet on the political scale, we see a significant change, and that is Trump has now paused all US military aid to Ukraine. Not the US aid program, but military aid to Ukraine has been completely stopped. Everything that was in the process of being sent has been stopped. And this is extremely critical for Ukraine, because Ukraine have dozens of military systems that they are using from the United States, such as Patriot air defense systems, the HIMARS MLRS systems, and most of their artillery also comes from the United States. The United States has alone given more military aid to Ukraine than the European Union combined. It is really close, but the United States have given more than the European Union in total. And that is not just because the European Union is not giving enough, but because they can't give more than what they're already giving. The current rate at which they're providing aid to Ukraine is at the maximum capacity that they can send. Now, this would mean that there would be significant consequences to the Ukrainian military capability if this stop and pause continues. Especially if it continues and no additional aid is given, then Ukraine would rely entirely on the European Union to fight this war, which is not nearly enough. The Patriot system would run out of ammunition, the HIMARS systems would run out of ammunition, and much more of the equipment would run out of the ammunition and they would not be usable. At the same time, they will not be gaining additional equipment, which is necessary to continue this war, and we will see that the frontline situation will completely change as the Russians would gain a complete upper hand in this conflict. The European Union would not be able to give the proper air defense needed to Ukraine, especially since the European Union countries are currently buying up air defense for themselves because they are significantly lacking in air defense themselves. So we see that Ukraine would be in significant need of air defense, and this will allow the Russians to have a significant air superiority or may even reach air supremacy in most of Ukraine. And this could completely switch around the way and amount of air support that the Russian forces would receive. At the same time, the Russians would be able to really completely outgrow the Ukrainian military capacity and capability. And this really shows that the situation right now is extremely favorable to Russia and terrible for Ukraine. And this shows that the Russians may right now be completely switching around their plan to conquer Ukraine, potentially even upping their goals to include several additional regions, or potentially switching around the tactics, strategies to capture what they're already planning to capture. In either case, what we're seeing is that without US military aid, Ukraine could face a military collapse. However, according to a senior Trump official who is anonymous, he told Fox News that the military aid is only a pause and not a termination, and it will resume once Zelenskyy commits to peace. And what does that really mean? It likely means that Zelenskyy commits not to peace, but to Trump's ideal of a peace settlement in Ukraine, which so far has been the cause of the dispute between Ukraine and the United States. And that is that Trump wants Ukraine to give concessions in a peace deal. He claims that he wants both sides to give concessions, and this is what Zelenskyy refuses to do without also getting security guarantees from the United States. He doesn't believe that security guarantees from Europe is enough. He wants them from the United States specifically, and Trump is refusing to do so. This part of an article from CNN talks about the impact of US aid and how the pause will not be felt immediately, but will take some time, maybe days or weeks. The impact of the US pause in military aid to be felt among Ukraine's battlefield fighters will take perhaps several days or weeks, but once the country's current stocks begin running short, the effect would be severe, even if other nations rush to fill the gap, an American official familiar with the matter said. There is a capability gap that Europe cannot fill alone. When your supplies get cut in half, eventually that shows up on the front lines. The front lines would continue to buckle and eventually they would break, and Ukraine could have to accept an adverse, even catastrophic peace settlement. But Kansian warned the Trump administration has more forms of aid to Ukraine that can be paused or cancelled altogether, including intelligence sharing and the training of Ukrainian forces. There might be a way out of this, but it's going to be extremely humiliating for Zelenskyy, Kansian said, referring to Ukraine's president. So what does this mean for the current situation across the front line? Well, it really means that the Russians, who currently have the upper hand and have had the upper hand for a year and 5 months now, would see a significant increase in their advantage if this pause continues. The longer it continues for, the bigger an advantage the Russians will get and gain from this, and the better the situation becomes for the Russians, who may see a significant increase in the territory captured by the Russians, and an impasse following the capture of several fortified positions and preparing for the new layer of defensive fortifications they have to go through. The Russians have already met a stalemate in the Pokrovsk section of the front line due to continuous Ukrainian counterattacks. The direction of Velika Novosilka they were capturing a lot at the end of February. Now with full capture of the fortified positions, there's not much left to capture beyond that of the first line and final line of defense here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. In the direction of Toretsk, the Ukrainians continue with the counterattacks. The Russians sent 3 regiments to support the defense of the city and to capture the remaining parts, and this shows how the situation there is critical as well. But the relocation of forces also slows down the Russian advances in other sectors of the front line. The Ukrainians also restarted counterattacks in the direction of Chasiv Yar to regain control and free up the siege of the central parts of the city. So you see a lot of heavy fighting there and a stalemate there as well, with the main advances taking place in the direction of Liman and Kupiansk. We also see that the Ukrainians have restarted counterattacks in the direction of Kupiansk, and with the Russian capture of the forest patch area east of Yampolivka, they have secured the positions ahead of the Battle of Tursk. So what we're really seeing is likely a break before the next parts, the next session and the next section of the offensive operations by the Russians to capture the remaining parts of the Donetsk region and the eastern bank of the Usk River line. And this is why we are likely seeing this lack of advances by the Russian forces. We're likely seeing a rotation and a break in the fighting for the Russians to adapt to the current situation, to beat the Ukrainian counterattacks, and to restart the gaining of territories and the offensive operations in the eastern section of the front line. Meanwhile, in the Kursk region, we also see that the Russians recently captured the town of Svetlikovo and the river line, the Luknia river line. So the fighting is now being prepared to capture Malaya Luknia and Luknia to gain control over the remaining parts of the Luknia river line and to start attacking Sucha from the northern bank. And with the Ukrainian counterattacks defeated in the southern flank and the eastern flank of Sucha, the Russians will likely restart offensive operations there as well. So we're seeing that we're currently at a stage where we can call it a transitional period from the current offensive operations taking place, the current goals having been reached, and the advantages thereof being reached, to new offensive operations starting, offensive operations to capture fortified positions and cities such as Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, and Liman in the eastern section of the front line, as well as to regain full control over the Kursk region. That is likely what the Russian forces are aiming for right now, to gain control over the remaining parts of the Donetsk region in the southwestern flank, gain control over the city of Pokrovsk, start the siege of Konstantinivka from the western, eastern, and southern directions, and to gain control over the town of Liman here along the northern bank of the Severodonetsk river line, as well as the remaining parts of the eastern bank of the Oskil river line. From this, we see that the Russians are working here to improve their positions in the eastern section of the front line ahead of an offensive to gain control over the remaining parts, and that is the second final stage of the fighting in the Donetsk region, where following these captures, the Russians will look to gain control over the Slavyansk-Konstantinivka line in its entirety, and thereby the entire Donetsk region, to gain full control over both the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.